Great. So welcome everybody to this remote interview. My name is Lisette and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. And today on the line, I've got something special. I've got Alissa Carpenter all the way from Philadelphia in the US. And Alissa, you're a workplace communications expert and the owner of a company called Everything's Not Okay and That's Okay, and the author of a book called How to Listen and Be Heard. So we're going to get into all of that. But first, let's start with the first question, which is, what does your virtual office look like? What do you need to get your work done?
Yeah, well, it's funny, not funny, but before all of this, I would say this really quiet space in the corner of my guest room. But finding a quiet space these days with a puppy and two kids is tough. But I do need a space that is dedicated to work. If I have a TV or just something else in the background or laundry, I can easily get distracted of other things that I need to do. So my space is in the corner of a master bedroom or spare bedroom with books, everything that I need kind of at the ready, so I don't have to leave, because then I can get distracted to then kind of come back. So everything's really dedicated in this one space for me set aside.
Okay, and what kind of remote worker are you? Tell us a little bit about what setup that you have with your company and your business.
Yeah, so I usually travel, but in terms of remote now, I do a lot of virtual trainings and speaking engagements with companies and organizations. I have lights set up and cameras and different things to make it a more lively experience when working virtually. So people can still feel like we're connected in that same space. Um, but I don't use Zoom backgrounds and things like that because I want people to be able to see that I'm just a person, just like everybody else with mess or whatever, whatever that case may be in the background of the trainings that I do.
Yeah, it does humanize it to just, yeah, I've got my Zen background, but it's more for the lighting because there's like a window and stuff. But yeah, but I do like the Zoom backgrounds, I must say, because it can set the mood
Hmm.
sometimes. So sometimes I'll use the Zoom background just to like set a mood, or if I want to like have you, or sometimes if I do my podcast, I'll do like a recording studio in the background. But
Yes.
so something fun, like, oh yeah, I'm in a studio. But okay, so let's get into what you do. So I want to first start with your book because I think it's really exciting. Your book just came out. It's called How to Listen and Be Heard. Tell us a little bit about the book and why you decided to write it.
Yeah, this has been something that I've wanted to write for so long. So the book itself, it's an easy read. It's 16 chapters. There's also a glossary of terms in there with diversity and inclusion terms to get people started and to really think differently. And the chapters are a very easy read. They have 41 different stories throughout the book. I wanted to be able to highlight other people's experiences with inclusion, with diversity, with communication, with microaggressions, and all these things that we deal with. And the chapters vary from really understanding if you're a toxic coworker to defining other toxic coworkers to writing professional emails, how to have communication with people who you might offended or who might have offended you. So there's really a wide variety of topics. And at the end of the day, it's about employees at any level feeling empowered that they can create this more inclusive organization, regardless of the level they are.
Okay, so we'll get into inclusivity, but you've brought up, there's a couple of words that all of a sudden I thought, oh, I want to dive into that. So you mentioned microaggression and toxic coworkers. And now I know on remote teams, this is a huge issue because, we can just close the laptops and walk away. So, and a lot of passive aggressive behavior tends to come out on remote teams, especially. So, and I really like the idea. You said you can check if you yourself are a toxic coworker. So I want to dive into that first. What do you mean by microaggression? Maybe let's start there. What is that exactly?
And I can give an example to make it a little bit more relevant. But microaggressions are essentially things that we say or do that can be offensive, and we don't realize that they're offensive. If you're thinking about just a general meeting introduction, whether virtual or in person, and I'm introducing, hi, this is Alissa Carpenter. She is the director of the marketing team. Hi, this is Sal Smith. He is the director of the insurance team, and this is Sam. She's the director. She played basketball in her college. So I've seen that so many times and have heard that so many times from people on either end of the conversation. And one individual I actually interviewed for my podcast was saying that they were often introduced as the person who played basketball in college, and everybody else, it was their name and it was their title. And then they started to reflect internally, well, why am I here, right? What am I meant to be in this conversation? Did you only hire me because I play basketball? Is it because I'm Black? It's all of these things. And the individual introducing probably didn't think about those things. And that's just how, they like basketball and this person played basketball. So these
Right.
microaggressions are just things that we potentially say or do that are not meant to be offensive, right? They're not outright racism, but they very much impact how we interact with other people, how we're being viewed. And especially if they're said over time and consistently, it can really, really impact the culture of the organization.
So how do we know when we're doing them? Is it up to other people to tell us?
Sadly, sometimes, because we don't know, right? And oftentimes you
Yeah.
say or do things, and that's what's so tough about just miscommunication in general, or reviews. Once a year, you finally tell somebody what they've said or done, or how they've completed work that wasn't to the best of their ability. If we're not having those conversations, you're going to continue to do it because you didn't know that it was being offensive, and you're not outright trying to be mean or rude. You didn't know. So unfortunately, some of the onus, not all of it, comes on that person who feels marginalized, who feels that they were in an uncomfortable situation. And, depending on what somebody says, no, we're talking about microaggressions versus outright racism and sexual harassment and
Right.
things like that. But those conversations, if you feel comfortable with the individual, is to start to have them. Or if you have built relationships and people have become allies and, have conversations with them. But we have to start to have dialogue about things that offend us if we want to see change.
So how do we do it? So my first instinct would be like write an email, and I immediately can feel when I say that is not the right medium for me, or maybe it is. I'm not sure, but it just feels intuitively like not the right medium.
It's in one of the chapters too in the book. I even break down what medium to use for certain things because people, there's
Awesome.
even a phrase of the medium is the message, right? If how we are sending information, and oftentimes we think that I'm an email person, so I'm going to email you because I'm an email person, but that person on the other end might not be. Anything, in my opinion, that could have conflict, a little bit uncomfortable. We want to be able to see that person. Now, I'm always defer to face. Obviously, in times like this, face-to-face might be more difficult, but a Zoom call, something where you can see the person, so you can at least have this virtual face-to-face and see maybe some of those social cues that you might be missing before. And it's about you. I feel this way. This phrase was said. I feel offended by this. This is what it means to me. It's not about other people in that situation. It's about how you feel and how this has impacted you. And it is very tough to have those conversations. It's not a public conversation. So for that
Okay.
individual, thinking about if you're in that meeting at that time, having that conversation right then and there is probably not appropriate. But taking the time afterwards, going up to them and saying, do you have a few minutes? I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what happened in the meeting. And then just sitting down with them, finding a neutral location. So a place where you feel you're on that same level. Maybe I love walking meetings, standing meetings, places where they're not in the power
Mm.
seat or you're not in that power seat, where you're level and it's becoming a dialogue. So they don't feel attacked and you don't feel a lot of as much pressure because you're in that same space.
So one of the things that I always say for on remote teams, or one of the things I teach in my workshop, is we need to put feedback loops in place, because there's all these little teeny tiny things that come up, which sometimes even speaking about them makes it into a bigger deal than it actually is. Like you're just like annoyed at something, and it's so easy to just not say anything because it's not that big of a deal, and maybe I'm just in a bad mood today, and like,
Yep.
do I really need to tell Ralph I'm annoyed? It's one of those things. So how do you know when to say something? When is it too little? And yeah, how would you advise stuff like that for on remote
And
teams?
And I've even talked to you about in my TEDx talk and my book, there was a situation when I was earlier on in my career and we were in a group setting and my supervisor at the time said, your face looks like the map of Jerusalem. And it was like exactly, right? Completely wildly inappropriate. We were talking about diversity, that you can't see people's religion and race. And it was just this fascinating, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. And I did not bring it up, which obviously it affects me now and wish I had, but earlier on in my career, especially when you're talking about different levels of people and if you say something, am I going to be fired? Is this inappropriate? Should they be able to say that to me? Right? You start to question all these things. But if something's going to impact the way that you work with somebody or the way that you do work in the organization, I always think that it's good to bring up. Some things you can brush off as, especially now during, difficult times, people are going to be a little bit more short. Your emails are going to be shorter. People are going to be a little bit more snippy because there's just so much going on. But if you're
Yeah.
noticing this pattern or trend and somebody is just consistently doing it and then it's impacting the way you're having a relationship with them in the workplace or you're talking with other people and this is always in the back of your mind, I always think that it's a good thing to bring up.
What if they don't want to talk?
And they might not. And it's okay if that other individual, they have the right to say that they don't want to talk, just as if somebody would come to you and ask you questions. The issue
Right.
being that things might not change. And it's going to be difficult, right, to have these conversations, one-off conversation, two-off conversation, especially if you're not their superior. We can't force somebody to change their behavior, right? We can change the way we look at things. We can change our attitude. We can change our perspective. If this continues and other people do it and it's becoming a toxic place, rethink, is this where I want to be, right? If these people are not willing to change and our leadership is not willing to do anything about it, is this really where I want to be? It is.
Right. Yeah, totally right. Because maybe it's a job you really love, but there's like this one person or whatever, this situation.
And
Yeah,
can you
it's never
avoid
easy.
that too, right? So sometimes it's a one-off situation or this person is toxic to you, but you have to work with them for this project and that's it. Or you can work on, other projects and do different things. Is there a way to work around it so you're not working with this individual? There's no reason to keep putting yourself in these situations because it doesn't just affect your mental health at work, right? You come home or go to a different room if you're working virtually and you're upset, right? You don't want to be
Right. It
able
takes
to.
up capacity.
Yes. Then you get snippy and short with other people because you're upset about this situation. Is there a way that you can avoid or work around, this particular person? Because it's very
Right.
hard to create change, but when you also feel, if that other person feels attacked, it makes it even harder for them to want to do anything, especially if they're not willing to make a change or think they did anything wrong.
How do you know if you're the toxic coworker?
Oh man, it is. And I've talked too about in my book about being a toxic coworker. And people laugh. They're like, how can you possibly be a toxic coworker? You're such a positive person. But I think we all have times where we've become that toxic coworker, whether or not we want to believe it or not. And in my instance, it was a colleague who went from person to person trying to get buy-in on kind of negative things that were happening and I wasn't buying in, right? I wasn't biting until one day I was upset about something and it just kind of, then I became that person who went from person to person and became that gossiper. And I knew for me, it was that shift in attitude. I knew I was a really positive person and I was coming home from work very snippy, very frustrated. And I didn't like that. I saw this change that I didn't like and realized, you know what? I am that person. I am becoming that toxic person. So doing a little bit of reflection, is this the person you want to be? Are you seeing a difference in your attitude when you're in work? Are you noticing that you're being a little snippier with the people that are closest to you at home? I think are trying things, asking for feedback, really tough, but it is a good opportunity to see what toxicity might look like. What do people feel about their relationship? Doing 360 reviews, getting that anonymous feedback, I think is huge. I think that's crucial, and being able to develop those relationships. But it's not easy. We have to be willing and open to realize that we might be that toxic person, or if we're thinking we know how to do our job, it's great, but everybody else in every other team doesn't know how. It's wait a minute, right? How can
Right.
everybody else in the organization be toxic, but we're not? It's
Right.
again,
I
it's
think
difficult.
everybody has a little toxicity in them, of course, right? Like on a bad day, or if I'm really tired, like, yeah, I'm just not at my best. I'm not my nicest being, of course. So yeah, yeah, we all have a little toxicity to acknowledge. I can,
And those
yeah,
toxic moments are very different from being a toxic colleague that's bringing down the culture potentially of your organization. So I think that that's very different. And being able to distinguish between your toxic moments of having a bad day versus, is this a pattern, right? Am I establishing a
right.
new pattern or new behavior in myself that is bringing me down, my team, or my organization down?
So what changes with communication? And this might be a very too broad of a question, so feel free to answer it in any way that the direction you want to take it in. But what is the difference in communication in a remote workplace versus in person together? What are the
Yeah. I think it's different, but it's the same, and communication is very important. And I do not believe that you can over communicate. I think specifically in a virtual workplace, you don't have that run in with a colleague, maybe in the bathroom, you might see them, or getting coffee, or in a hallway where you're able to just grab them for 2 seconds and ask them a question. You have to be very proactive in order to get answers, to be able to build relationships with people virtually, setting expectations. So that to me is a big kind of difference. People don't know when you've completed work or if you're busy, if you don't physically see them. So being able to communicate what your schedule's like, is in a 9 to 5 in your time zone and somebody else's, what's the best way to communicate with you, especially as we're going through everything right now. People are
hmm,
feeling very tied to their computer and their cell phone, and all of those things. And their mental health is very stressful right now. There's a lot of burnout. So being able to communicate with people virtually, the best way to reach you, when to reach you, what is an emergency, what's not an emergency, is just very crucial, specifically in virtual workspaces.
how would you communicate that to one another? Is it like do you say like, okay, here is my communication style. This is how I like it, or do you come together as a team to discuss how we're going to do it, or what do you advise?
I think you should do both. One is an individual, especially if you're starting within an organization. I think you have the free reign as a new employee to say, this is the best way to communicate with me, and asking your supervisor, what is the best way to communicate with you? One off, I think if you're a newbie, you can ask these questions. But
Hmm.
having an really a communication guideline for yourself also is very crucial. And I don't think there's a problem with asking people directly, what is the best way to communicate with you every day? What is the best way to communicate in general? Having a team communication protocol of, this is a type of information and how we share it this way. This is how we reach each other. We have meetings every Monday. I have office hours here. If it's an emergency, text or call me. So you have your individual preferences, but you have your group and team norms also when it comes to communication.
So just get together and sit down with the team and discuss like, okay, how do we want to do this?
Yes.
I'm actually surprised at how many companies or teams don't have this in place. Like we just sort of get together and start working and we figure it out as we go. And I keep thinking, man, you would solve so many problems if we just sat down. I mean, I've made the mistake too, so I'm not sitting here on my high horse, that's for sure.
No,
But
no.
but it's like, how many miscommunications could we have avoided had we just sat down and said, okay, we're not going to use WhatsApp for this.
But it's
Instead, we're
too, and you have so much technology, and we think about the technology sometimes as a solution, but not necessarily how to use it. So we say, this is WhatsApp, this is how we use it. You click on this button and you send this message, but we don't say when to use it and why to use it. And we're missing those components, or we just assume that we know the best way to communicate with someone because we know the best way to communicate with us. So it's really about the receiver of the message and not the sender if we want somebody to respond. But it's what's difficult about it is you're going to be flip-flopping between, this person wants a text, this person wants an email, this person wants a phone call. So it's getting together and having that conversation and realizing this is a bend or flex situation. And you can push back a little bit, especially if you are billing hourly and you need to have something written down, via email that you were working on this particular case, or a phone call recorded, or whatever the case may be. You can keep track of all that information and be able to articulate a little bit better as to why you need to be communicated in this way.
Oh, I love it. I want to dive into your book because as I've taught, so your book is called How to Listen and Be Heard. And as I have taught remote meetings master classes, and I have a co-facilitator who's really involved in the clean language community, which is all about listening and speaking in metaphors and speaking in another person's language. And I've only touched the very surface, so I'm a total newbie to the whole concept, but it's blowing my mind in terms of how powerful it is. So I'm assuming, so how do you listen better? Because it sounds so simple, right? You're just saying like, oh no, we need to listen better. But what I'm learning from Judy Reese is her name, is there's a whole world behind how to listen better. So what does your listening world look like, I should
Oh,
ask?
it is. I keep saying like, this is tough. It is tough. Listening is so hard. And when we think about communication, we think about the speaking element of it and not the listening element of it, which is more so part of communication. Because if you're not listening or hearing what the other person is saying, you're not able to respond or not respond in a way in which makes sense for the conversation. So even thinking about, and what can be difficult about virtual workspaces, and I noticed too, after having just so many conversations with people, that some cultures are open to a video chat within work, some are not. And it is very distracting to me when you don't see somebody's video to be an active listener. If I don't see you, if I don't see your facial movements or anything, it's so easy to pick up your phone, just get distracted in other places. So being able to have those visual cues to me is a very helpful tone on when to be a listener, and listen to when they finish. Oftentimes we want to respond to people in their mid-sentence because we think that they're done or we already have an idea of what they're going to say, but really wait until they finished, pause, and then be able to articulate and say an answer. And I'm working on it because it is one of those things that, especially doing interviews, you want to ask another question or you're really excited about a response, and it's hard to take that step back and not process through that.
Yeah, I'm a chronic interrupter because I get super excited and then I've got to just say what I got to say. But you're right, it's not good listening. In fact, it's good to just wait till people are done. And what I've noticed is that pause is very important because by listening, you're helping somebody think.
Mm-hmm.
And that pause is part of the process. So it's super powerful. So how can one be heard? Let's go to the other side of that.
Yeah, and there's so many different ways. And even in the book, I talk about identifying your strengths and figuring out what your strengths are to really use that to your advantage. And when I think about even being heard, it's also how to influence other people and who you want to be heard by. Because when we're talking about influencing people or bringing an idea that needs to be from the top bottom kind of approach, how do those individuals like to be influenced? They want data or facts that are really going to bring things to light. And if you're able to provide that, people are going to listen more to what you have to say of, I have this great idea. It's not really, they're not gut people. They don't want to feel this great idea. They need the data and facts to prove that this is something that's going to work. Is somebody really, and most people gravitate towards stories. Can you share a client story or a touching story or something that's happened where those people can gravitate towards it? They're really inspired by it, influenced by it, and then you can share and then you're kind of heard. Oftentimes too, especially when we're talking about virtual spaces, it's about stepping out of your comfort zone and sharing your ideas. So if you're given the agenda ahead of time, looking through that agenda and figuring out, what do I know, right? What is my area of expertise that I can share, and being prepared to really share your thoughts during those times. So it's kind of two-way of providing value through what you're saying, and then providing it in a way that people can be influenced to listen and to take your idea to the next level.
It sounds like a lot of self-reflection and like, it's really like, oh my God, I really have to reevaluate like what, I mean, in a way, because you have to think in terms of what is the style of this person and what are they needing from me instead of what is it that I want to push out into the world. It depends. I mean, you're on both sides, right? Depending on where if you're in a meeting and you want to influence somebody, it's what am I pushing out? But if you're on the other end of that, it's how do I listen? It just sounds like a lot of self-reflection, which is good, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, but it's tough, right? It's a balancing act between kind of both. At the end of the day, if you're trying to, let's say you're trying to get a raise within an organization, saying you need a raise because you have 2 kids or your mortgage payment is high or whatever the case may be, nobody, I'm gonna say nobody cares, but we care. but that doesn't mean that your work or what you're doing is worthy of getting that promotion. Yes, people want you to be able to pay your mortgage, but you need to be able to think in terms of what is the greater good of the value of what you're sharing, how will it benefit your group, your team, your organization, and looking at
Right.
those clues, right? Looking at those context clues of going back of, okay, our team came up with this really great idea. How did we influence people? And sometimes we might not be those influencers. So teaming up with other people on our team or other parts of the organization that can help us really think through our messaging so we can get buy-in, right? And it could be somebody in another team, our team, somebody who we have a good partnership with us that maybe has different strengths and talents that we do that can really bring our ideas or bring us to life.
Man, it sounds simple, but it doesn't sound simple, but it sounds simple, but it's so complex. It's like complex in its implementation. But there's something before, because we're going to run out of time, which is crazy. It's going so fast. But one of the things that I read about your book is that it shows us how to bridge the communication gap caused by differences in, you list age, race, religion, gender. And I feel like one of the things that remote teams really offers is the ability for diversity of all kinds. You know, it's not like, yeah, like you said, race, age, religion, but like cat people versus dog people, like beach people versus forest people. Like it could be all kinds of diversity. However, you know, like age, race, religion, gender, those tend to be the really big ones. What are some of the tips that you can give for bridging that? Like how does one approach that, especially when we don't know what we don't know?
Yes, and that's a big one. We need to know why diversity is important and why inclusion is important. And we can have diversity
Oh,
without inclusion, but we can't have inclusion without diversity. And I think sometimes, especially in the virtual workspace, it's just easier to defer to people who think and who act and who experience life differently or the same as you. So you're asking people to come to meetings who share your ideas and experiences. So we need to break through that status quo. And I think even the sharing and seeing physical people in the boxes when you're on a Zoom call or team chat, whatever the case may be, helps you to be able to see the diversity that is or is not there. Being able to ask the questions and outright saying, does anybody have an idea that might be different? What haven't we talked about or shared that can be of value? You know, what experiences have you had that might be a little bit different, or challenge me? Why might this idea not work? We need to be open to asking those questions, to getting the responses, because especially in virtual, if you're not seeing people or people think, okay, nobody's saying anything, that means nobody has an idea or nobody wants to bring something up. It doesn't mean that it's not the case. And also partnering different people. I love reverse mentoring programs or talking with people before a meeting and saying, you've had really great experience with this client. Can you share it during this meeting? I think a lot of people can value it. Or we're looking for, you know, this session, we want to brainstorm different ideas. This is what I need from you before, because not everybody wants to brainstorm at the same time. So if we're looking for different ideas and new perspectives, we have to welcome it, we have to ask for it, and we have to act upon what people are saying. But sometimes it's hard to make the argument for diversity. People don't see necessarily the value or know the difference between having diversity and what that is, and then actually including people. Because to me, it's part of a larger spectrum. If people are different, that's fine, then great. But if they're not being included and we're not asking those questions, there's no point in having people with different opinions or from different backgrounds if we're not doing anything with it.
those questions are really important, but how does one go about learning those? Besides buying your book, that would be the number one way, of course, and to get Alyssa's book. But how would one go? Like, where would you point people towards if they wanted to learn? Because I think the questions that you pose, like who's got something different, are really valuable. But it's not the first thing that might come to your head when you're in these conversations. So how would one learn?
Yeah, or even writing them down beforehand. I've worked with clients too
Ooh.
of, okay, you're going to go to this meeting. Here are 5 questions that you might want to bring up or ask, or 5 points that you might want to share. Because sometimes you forget, you're in that moment and you're in the meeting, you're like just in that zone, and then you forget to ask those questions, or you think you have. So writing them down ahead of time and challenging yourself to say, I'm going to ask this one question, I'm going to ask these 2 questions during the meeting. If you're not that person, if that does not instinctively, so going back to strengths, includer is my number one strength. It's just innately what I think about, but a lot of people don't. If you don't see that in yourself and realize, okay, I haven't included other people, or I tend to reflect on who you tend to bring to meetings, who's your network, ask somebody else who might be a value add to this project or this meeting, who from our organization would have a different perspective. So ask somebody else. It's a lot of internal reflection, but it's not all on you. You have your network, you have your team, you have your peers and organization. Rely on them, ask them for support, ask them for help. So you're not solely responsible for bringing everybody in.
Right, right. That's such a good thing, because we do, again, we don't know what we don't know. So sometimes, right, bringing somebody else in, they'll ask something and you think, oh, I wouldn't have ever even thought of that. I mean, it happens so often. It happens so often. On the other hand, you also have to dare to ask these questions, because they are, I mean, it sounds really simple, but I think when I think about some of the meetings that I've been in, if I were to dare to ask, okay, who's got something different, or who wants to challenge this idea? I mean, then you're getting a challenge to an idea that you have to deal with. So I think inviting that is also, it's a bit scary.
It's so scary. It's being, and I love Brene Brown, and this is a very vulnerable experience. And I think oftentimes we, especially as leaders, you're used to giving feedback, and now's the time that you're asking for it. And it's scary. It's scary to put yourself out there and think, okay, I thought I wasn't, I thought I was including people, or I thought I was doing everything I could, and realizing maybe I'm not. But we can't learn and grow as individuals, as organizations, as teams, if we don't take this risk. And all at once, you might not ask these 5 questions. You might ask one person during a one-on-one, one of these questions, what could you do differently, or what support do you need from me that you're not getting? And then take it from there, right? Getting that rush of information and you never asked for it before can be extremely alarming, and you might feel extremely overwhelmed. So take these little steps that you're willing to take, but it requires vulnerability regardless of the level of step that you're taking.
Right. And then I would think the first thing that comes to mind is start small. Like, don't go all in, like start with little things and then practice. I can already see myself
Yeah.
bombing.
This
Yeah.
is not a never did it 200-person meeting. What can we do differently, right? This is a one-on-one. Maybe you have your small groups, or whatever that is. Start small and maybe use that information that you've gained and bring it to a larger meeting, and then keep bringing that information, so then you're more prepared and more equipped. You can actually call out that person and say, Sally told me that Sally brought up this really great idea, and I think it's really beneficial for our team. And you're calling out
Ooh.
the person, you're giving them credit, and then you're showing and sharing that you've been asking for feedback, right? You really value that team response.
So just a couple more questions, and I promise we'll end on time, but or end on time-ish. But I'm really curious about leadership, like communication and leadership, because I feel like, okay, on remote teams, everybody has to be proactive, everybody has to do their part, but leaders especially have to set the tone. So where do you see remote leaders going wrong in terms of their communication in general? I know that's also another broad question, but
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think sometimes it's the lack of communication or no communication. And it's a tough balance to strike between, because in a virtual workspace, you have to trust the people that you've hired that work for you, that they're going to complete their job. So I've seen this micromanagement over communication, but not in a productive way, just constant, what's going on, what's happening all the time. And then I've seen, okay, now these people are on this island, this place on their own, and they don't know what the expectations are. They don't know when they have to complete this assignment, and it's coming to this common place. And I've seen a lot of companies and work with companies to even create, maybe it is a Google Doc of this person's responsible for what, this is due this day, this other person on this team is done this, and it's a shared document where I as an individual know what I'm responsible for, the leader knows what I'm responsible for, I can check things off so they know. Because it's oftentimes that, not that people aren't completing it, they just don't know who to tell that they've done it and when and why. It's closing that loop, like you were saying before, that tends to be missing, because you don't run into somebody and are like, oh, I got that, I finished that, don't worry about that. You're missing that off the cuff conversation. So unless you proactively loop somebody back in some way, they're not going to know.
right. So one, make it visible, and then the next one would be close the loop.
Yes.
Like, speak out. Oh, I love it. That's really good. So I'm gonna write it down, make it visible, and close the loop. That's a super good reminder. And second to the last question, which is, if people were just starting out on this topic, like they hear this podcast and they're like, oh my God, I need to learn how to listen and be heard. One, they've got to buy the book, but what advice would you give for just starting out in this area?
Talk to somebody that you trust, that you know, you like, you trust. Maybe it's a mentor, maybe it's a close colleague, and start to have these conversations of, what are things that I could do differently, or what support that do you think that I might be able to give that I haven't been giving? Really have these candid and open conversations, not with a broader whole, but with people that you really trust and value their opinion. It's not the yes people, it's the people who will challenge you and say, you were great at this, but these 3 areas I've been really struggling with, to be able to work with you. Do some reflection in terms of communication that you've been sending out. Maybe it's, how people are responding. Do you usually give paragraphs and paragraphs and people are not reading your information? And maybe it's time to do some bullet points, for people to be able to see and do that. So look back at your past practices of people in the organization, and then reach out to people who you value their opinion and will challenge you at the same time.
And be gentle.
Yes.
Gently challenging, kindly challenging, maybe.
Yes, there's a way to do that. There's this, this happy place, I'll call it, where, I want to be challenged. You want to learn, you want to be able to grow, but you don't want to feel insulted or feel that everything that you are doing is wrong. It's about saying it in a way that's constructive, and it's feedback of what happened in the past and feed forward of what can I do differently, right? Let's work together and create a plan to have some forward thinking about how I can adjust my practices.
Totally love it. Okay, so very last question is, if people want to learn more about you, what's the best place to find you and your book?
Sure. The book can be found Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold. I'm active on LinkedIn, just under my name, Alissa Carpenter, and very active also on Twitter. And my handle is not okay, that's okay.
Love it. Okay, so I'm sorry, I have one more question. How did you come up with this business name? Everything's not okay and that's okay. It's so good.
Oh, thank you. It's also so long. So when I was trying to do social media handles, it became a little bit difficult, but it's through actually my experience working in higher ed. I worked at college and universities for about 12 to 13 years. And even just seeing the students with their friends and saying, everything's great, everything's wonderful. And then coming in my office and just totally breaking down and realizing I was doing that. My colleagues were doing that. And it's this, we put on this face that we feel like we need to pull on, that everything is great, everything is fine, when in reality, there are things behind that curtain that we need to reveal that can make us more human. And that's what I love even about, not about what's happening now, but with a virtual space is, you're going to hear things, you're going to see things. It makes us more human. Everything's not okay. That's okay. We can work together, to create a solution, to have conversations about making things different, right? And changing them.
Love it. I think that's also a beautiful way to end this conversation. So everything's not okay and it's okay. And I'll put all of that in the show notes. And but thank you, Alissa. It has been really awesome. I took copious notes today on everything. So the show notes should be nice and meaty. But I really appreciate your time and you sharing your knowledge with the audience today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Until next time, be powerful.